Shaquille O'Neal just wanted a cup of coffee. But when he watched a Black War veteran ignored for 40 minutes in plain sight, he didn't just pay the bill. He bought the building. What he uncovered inside wasn't just racism. It was a cover-up buried for 60 years. Land stolen. A boy vanished. A town desperate to forget. Now Shaq isn't just serving coffee. He's serving justice. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. There are places where time feels like it's made a secret pact with silence, where memory lingers in the air, clinging to walls, pressing down on breath. This town had one of those places, a little café tucked just off the main square, all glass and gloss, and farmhouse charm. Maple and grain, the sign said, in slick woodcut letters like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Inside, the light was warm, the espresso machines purred like loyal dogs, and the playlist was just hip enough to keep the college kids coming back. But this wasn't about the coffee. It was about what didn't happen. He walked in like someone trained not to cause trouble. Back straight, cap low, eyes gentle but scanning. His jacket was old, military green, sleeves frayed at the cuffs. On his chest, the name patch still clung. Griggs. No one looked up when he entered. No one needed to. He was used to that. Walter Griggs was 78 years old, and had worn that army cap for longer than most of the baristas had been alive. He had fought in a war most of them forgot the moment they passed. The quiz in school. He came every Wednesday, same seat, corner near the window. Never loud, never late, and lately, never served. At first he thought it was a mistake. A new staff. A missed glance. So he waited. The line moved. The orders were taken. Almond milk. Oat milk. Extra foam. People chatted. Phones chirped. Cups clinked. And Walter stood. Patient. Dignified. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The barista, a tall gum-chewing girl with bleached eyebrows, looked right through him. Didn't even flinch when she stepped around him to call out, "Large caramel latte for Sarah." He shifted in place. Cleared his throat softly. A teenager with a man bun behind the counter gave him a side glance, and went back to wiping his station, slow and rhythmic. Like Walter wasn't there. 30 minutes. Then 40. No one spoke to him. Not a customer. Not a worker. One young woman, a jogger in neon, hesitated as she passed him, gave a strange guilty smile like she was seeing something she didn't know how to unsee. Then she turned away, went back to her earbuds. Coffee was more urgent. Walter didn't complain. He didn't tap the counter or demand attention. That wasn't who he was. He stood there holding the exact bill he always brought. $7 folded neat and waited for someone to remember he existed.
They didn't.
But someone else did. The door opened, with the kind of hush that drew eyes without meaning to, not because of the sound, but because of the presence. Big shoulders, warm hoodie, sunglasses hanging from a collar. Shaquille O'Neal stepped in like the sun slipping past the clouds, quiet, wide, and impossible to ignore. But in this moment, no one noticed him. They were too busy not noticing someone else. Shaq's eyes scanned the cafe. He didn't move fast. Didn't smile. Just observed. The woman at the register twirled her gum. The man-bun barista cracked a joke to a coworker. Walter shifted again, rubbing one knee, stiff from standing. Shaq tilted his head. He had played in packed stadiums, faced down giants, stared into the eyes of screaming crowds. But this silence, this subtle exclusion, it hit different. It wasn't loud. That's what made it cruel. He didn't ask for a menu, didn't greet the staff. He walked slowly to Walter's side, and stood there. For a moment it was two figures side by side. One tall, looming, famous. The other small, old, fading. The room grew aware. Not because Shaq said anything, but because his presence made people look again, and finally see. Shaq reached into his back pocket, pulled out his card, and walked to the register. The girl behind the counter blinked, suddenly all charm. "Can I help?" "Coffee," he said calmly. "For the gentleman over there." He pointed to Walter. The barista paused, eyes narrowing like a record skipped in her brain. She tried to recover.
Oh, sure. I didn't realize.
"Yeah," Shaq interrupted, voice steady. "I know." She took the card, hands a little slower now. The room had quieted. The people in line shifted awkwardly. Someone coughed. A phone buzzed, unanswered. Shaq took the coffee himself and walked it over, handed it to Walter without a word, and stood beside him once more. Walter nodded, faintly. His lips trembled, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. It was all written in the folds of his eye, in the way he held that cup like it weighed more than it should. A few seconds passed. Then Shaq turned. He walked back to the counter, slow but certain. "Is the owner in?" he asked. The girl froze. Brandon's not here right now. He usually comes after noon." "Cool," Shaq said. "Tell him I'm interested in the place." She laughed awkwardly. "Wait, you mean like buying a coffee or buying the café?" Shaq smiled slightly, eyes still on hers. "The café. That did it." The boy with the man bun dropped his cloth. A woman near the window stopped mid-sip. Even Walter looked up, blinking like he'd misheard. Shaq didn't explain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He just left his card with the girl behind the counter, said he'd be in touch, and walked out the way he came in, quiet, calm, and full of purpose. Behind him, the cafe buzzed, confused and awkward. But the silence left behind by Shaq's presence was deeper than before, like something had cracked open that wouldn't seal back shut. Walter sat in the corner, the coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't drink it yet, just held it, looked out the window. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen him, and that changed everything. Because sometimes it's not about grand gestures or loud speeches. Sometimes it's about standing next to someone long enough that the world has no choice but to see them too. In that cafe, on that ordinary Wednesday, a battle had been fought without fists, and something had shifted. No one knew yet what Big Shaq was planning. But the town was about to learn something real. He wasn't just buying coffee. He was buying the whole damn place. When a man like Shaquille O'Neal walks into a room, people usually notice his size, his presence, his voice. They carry a gravitational pull. But what happened that Wednesday morning at Maple and Grain wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about something older, something buried deep in the bones of the South, in the marrow of manners and money and memory. Shaq didn't come to make a scene. He came because he saw one already unfolding, one he'd witnessed in cities and suburbs and sidelines across the country. The slow dismissal of a man who had given his life to a country that never seemed to remember his name. And what made it worse was the comfort with which it happened. The rhythm, the ease, as if ignoring Walter Griggs wasn't an act of cruelty but part of the cafe's customer service routine. Shaq had stood in that room and seen it all play out like déjà vu. The way the workers moved around Walter like he was a coat rack. The way the customers, even those who glanced at him, looked away faster than guilt could rise in their throats. The ones who noticed but did nothing were the ones who stayed with Shaq the longest. But he didn't shout, didn't stomp his size 22s, didn't demand justice on the spot. Instead, he made a choice. He ordered the coffee, handed it to Walter, and then turned his full attention to the space that had allowed this to happen. His gaze didn't need volume. It only needed time. The girl at the register had taken his card with a rehearsed smile, but even she knew something had changed when he said he wanted to buy the place. Not rent a booth, not sponsor a drink, buy the entire building, and not because he needed another investment, but because he knew what ownership meant. Ownership meant the rules changed. That afternoon, before the gossip could finish its first lap around town, Shaq had his lawyers on the phone. Not the flashy sports agents, the quiet ones who specialized in contracts and commercial property and background checks. The kind of people who didn't flinch when Shaq said, "I want everything: building, name, licenses, inventory, full cash offer, no counter, just get it done." The legal machinery moved fast. A celebrity with unlimited funds and zero hesitation tends to get priority service. By nightfall, papers had been drafted. By the following morning, Brandon Cale, the cafe's founder, trust fund heir, and amateur real estate mogul, was sitting in a boutique law office 3 blocks away, staring at a number that made his mouth go dry. It was more than the cafe was worth. But Shaq wasn't buying the business. He was buying the conversation. Brandon, tall and tanned with a Rolex tan line and a curated social media presence, didn't understand it. Why would he want this place? He muttered to his lawyer, who only shrugged and slid the paperwork across the table. Brandon didn't need to know why. All he needed to do was sign. By noon, the deed had changed hands. Maple and Grain no longer belonged to a man who inherited land through whispers and backroom deals. It belonged to a man who had built his name with sweat, survived with integrity, and walked through the world like gravity owed him rent. The next morning, Shaq arrived at the cafe before sunrise. The staff didn't expect him. They found him sitting at a table near the window, sipping black coffee. No sugar, no milk, watching as the town blinked itself awake. The reactions came in waves. First shock, then curiosity, then suspicion. Brandon showed up late, sunglasses on, trying to play cool. He strutted in, expecting maybe a handshake, maybe a selfie. Instead, Shaq handed him a white envelope and nodded toward the door. Brandon didn't argue. He read the note. One line, handwritten in ink that looked steady and patient. Your chapter is closed. He left. The baristas were next. One by one, they hovered awkwardly, unsure what was happening, until Shaq stood up and addressed them. Not with a speech, not with anger. He just told them the truth. You still have your jobs, he said. But if you think what happened yesterday was acceptable, you should leave now. Two of them did. The others stayed. Maybe because they needed the paycheck. Maybe because they knew they'd been part of something wrong and wanted a chance to make it right. Shaq didn't ask for their reasons. He only asked for their honesty. From that day forward, it wasn't about smiles and latte art. It was about respect. Outside, the sign still read Maple and Grain. But the heart of the place had already begun to change. Shaq brought in a local muralist the following week. A young black woman named Davina, known for painting history into color. She started sketching the outlines of something bold across the back wall. Portraits, timelines, names, stories that had been erased, now returning to the surface. Meanwhile, Shaq walked the streets, talked to shopkeepers, listened more than he spoke. He learned about the town's history. Not the version in brochures, but the one buried in rumors and dusty boxes in the back of libraries. Stories of homes taken, businesses bought under duress, and families who vanished when the banks came calling. He learned that the land the cafe stood on had once been owned by a man named Joseph Griggs, Walter's grandfather, a black baker who ran the town's first multi-grain mill. The original building had burned down in the 1960s. No investigation, no suspects, just ashes and a silence that settled in like fog. Shaq didn't need revenge. He needed truth. So he started digging. Old deeds, county maps, church records, interviews with elderly residents who thought no one cared anymore. He connected dots the town had spent decades ignoring. And with each piece of the puzzle, the picture got clearer. What happened to Walter wasn't a one-off. It was part of a design. But designs can be rewritten. Shaq didn't host press conferences. He didn't tweet. He let the change speak through the space. The cafe's menu stayed the same for a while. But new items appeared, recipes donated by local black families, dishes with stories. The names weren't just flavors, they were echoes. The townspeople started talking. Some applauded, others grumbled. The word woke was tossed around like an insult. But Shaq didn't flinch. He wasn't interested in making people comfortable. He was interested in making them confront. And then, on a Thursday morning exactly 1 week after he first bought the place, Walter Griggs returned. He didn't expect a welcome. He didn't expect anything. But when he stepped through the door, everything stopped. The music, the movement, the conversations. Shaq was standing behind the counter, wiping down a coffee machine. He looked up, met Walter's eye, and nodded. Walter nodded back. He sat in the same chair, same spot, by the window. But this time, someone brought him coffee without being asked. And not just anyone. Shaq himself. He placed the cup gently on the table and said nothing. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the loudest kind of justice is silent. And sometimes change doesn't begin with fire. It begins with a cup of coffee handed from one man to another. Later that afternoon, the new sign went up. The old Maple and Grain letters came down with a quiet thunk, and in their place, fresh-cut oak letters carved deep with purpose. Griggs Sons. No one asked what it meant. But the town was beginning to understand that Big Shaq didn't come here to blend in. He came to rewrite the ending. When a system changes, it doesn't collapse with a bang. It groans. It resists. It pushes back in silence, hoping no one notices. Shaquille O'Neal knew this well. And so, after the deed had changed hands and the old sign had been taken down, he didn't walk into his new cafe with a parade or a press conference. He walked in like a storm cloud that knew it didn't have to thunder. All it had to do was stay. The first thing he did was gather the staff. The same crew who had seen Walter Griggs wait 40 minutes to be ignored, now stood in a tight half-circle, half curious, half terrified. They weren't sure if they were being fired or framed or fixed. They watched Shaq lean on the edge of the counter, arms crossed, his calm gaze sweeping over them like a quiet interrogation. He didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally did, it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was measured, like a judge reading a verdict no one could appeal. "You still have your jobs," he said, "but the cafe doesn't run like it used to. This ain't just a business anymore. This is a responsibility." The words landed different depending on who heard them. For some, it was a second chance. For others, it was a warning. The tall barista with the bleached eyebrows looked away. The man-bun kid kept nodding like he already regretted staying. One worker, a new hire named Lydia with dark skin and wary eyes, stood taller. She'd only been on staff 2 days before the buyout, but she had seen enough to know things weren't right. Shaq noticed. He didn't call her out, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer. Not suspicion, recognition. Then Shaq gave them the new rules. No customer is invisible. No seat is unworthy. No act of disrespect, subtle or otherwise, goes unchecked. Tips would be pooled, racial bias training would be mandatory, and community partnerships would be prioritized over profit margins. They didn't work for a brand anymore. They worked for a standard. He told them it wasn't about being perfect, just being accountable. No one quit that day. Not yet. But some started planning their exits. Change had walked in without knocking, and it was sitting at the table, rewriting the script. Later that morning, Brandon Cale showed up. It wasn't curiosity that brought him. It was ego. The kind of entitlement that doesn't like being told no in public, let alone having its name stripped off a storefront. Brandon wasn't dressed like someone who lost a business. He was dressed like someone heading to a yacht club luncheon. Pale blue blazer, expensive loafers, a Rolex so polished it could blind you in sunlight. He stepped inside with sunglasses still on, letting the glass door swing open behind him like punctuation. Shaq was behind the counter, elbows deep in a busted espresso machine. He didn't look up. Brandon smirked. "So this is it, huh?" His voice was loud enough for the customers. New, diverse, curious to hear. Big Shaq comes to town and turns a cafe into a charity. Still no reaction from Shaq. Brandon continued, walking in slow circles, surveying the space, like he still owned it. "You know, I built this place, picked the wood, designed the lighting, chose every bean we brewed." Shaq finally looked up. Just once. Not a glare, just a glance. Brandon chuckled, trying to keep his composure. "I mean, sure, the offer was generous. Stupid generous. But this whole crusade you're on, it's temporary. People get tired of activism. They want their vanilla lattes and free Wi-Fi, not lectures." Shaq stood up, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked around the counter. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just stared. Brandon faltered. Just slightly, like something cold brushed the back of his neck. "Look," Brandon said, voice lowering. "I get it. You saw something you didn't like. You're a good guy, Shaq. I've always said that. But this isn't how the world works. You can't fix racism with a smoothie bar." Shaq didn't blink, just took a slow step forward, towering over Brandon in a way that didn't feel threatening, but made the room quieter. "I don't fix racism," he said finally. "I replace people who protect it." Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it. 2 seconds later, he was gone. He didn't return, but his shadow lingered. There were whispers around town that Brandon wasn't done, that his family still owned buildings nearby, that he still had friends on the zoning board, that money talks even when its mouth has been shut. Shaq didn't respond to rumors. He responded with plans. He hosted open mic nights for black artists, created a pay-it-forward board for veterans and low-income visitors, started a program where local high schoolers could shadow baristas and learn about business ownership. The cafe transformed from a gentrified Instagram haven to a living, breathing pulse of the town, one that beat louder every week. And yet Walter Griggs didn't come back. Not for the unveiling of the mural. Not for the free coffee Fridays. Not for the veteran storytelling night. He disappeared the same way he'd lived, quietly, without ceremony. It was like he'd been a spark meant only to ignite the fire, not stand in its warmth. Shaq asked around, visited the small apartment building where Walter used to live, but the landlord said he'd moved out. No forwarding address, just packed his things in 2 suitcases, and left before sunrise. Left behind his army cot, and an old framed photo of a boy no one could name. It stuck with Shaq. The silence of it. The way some people vanish, not because they want to, but because they've learned the world doesn't hold on to them. He kept the photo in his office, tucked between blueprints and receipts. Not for decoration, for memory. Weeks passed. The cafe settled into its new rhythm. Tourists showed up, some genuinely interested, others trying to score that Shaq coffee shop selfie. Locals argued about it in diners and on Facebook groups. Some swore they'd never step foot inside a place that turned coffee into a pity party. Others brought their kids and called it the only place that ever made them feel seen. The staff adjusted. Some resisted. One quit after being asked to apologize to a customer she'd previously ignored. Others bloomed under the pressure, especially Lydia, who started managing the weekend shifts and began organizing pop-up events in the outdoor space. Shaq added beside the building. It wasn't just a job to her anymore. It was a platform. But beneath all the progress, Shaq felt the tension brewing. It wasn't loud yet, but it was there, in the way code enforcement dropped by twice in 1 week, just to check. In the anonymous calls to the health department that turned up nothing. In the way Brandon's old lawyer suddenly bought the building across the street and filed permits for a coffee chain franchise. It wasn't about drinks. It was about territory, about power. Shaq had spent a lifetime in arenas. But this was a different kind of court, one where the rules shifted behind closed doors, and the scoreboard was hidden from the crowd. Still, he didn't flinch, because this wasn't about winning. It was about holding the line. And behind that counter, in the place where Walter once waited, 40 minutes for recognition, now stood a team that saw every customer, every story, every scar. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And that, more than anything, was how you fight a system built on indifference, not with rage, but with refusal. Refusal to look away. Refusal to back down. Refusal to accept that silence is safer. The cafe had a new name, a new mission, a new boss. And the town had no choice but to see it now. Because Big Shaq didn't come here to blend in. He came to be seen. And to make sure others were too. There's something peculiar about small towns. The way they wear their past like old wallpaper. Faded but never fully stripped away. Layers of story buried beneath coats of paint, papered over with polite smiles and civic slogans. This town, with its red brick square and weathered courthouse clock, had all the charm of Southern hospitality. But Shaq had lived long enough to know charm was often the final defense of denial. He thought he was buying a cafe. He didn't know he was buying a secret. The renovation started simple. New paint, better wiring, reclaimed furniture from local craftspeople. Shaq wasn't interested in flashy upgrades. He wanted soul, history. He wanted the place to reflect the community it had ignored for so long. But as walls came down and floorboards came up, something else began to surface. The first clue came from a contractor named Ellis, an older black man who'd been laying brick in the county since the Reagan years. Quiet, steady, never one to make noise unless something truly needed saying. One afternoon, as he pried up the floor behind the back storage room, he found charred wood timbers blackened and cracked, sealed under newer panels, hidden like a wound never properly treated. Fire damage, he said, frowning. Old. Way older than this place. Shaq leaned over the spot. How old? Ellis shrugged, wiping sweat from his forehead. Judging by the wood type and the nail heads, maybe 60s. Maybe earlier. This building wasn't built from scratch. It was built on top of something else. That was the moment the shift began. Not in the structure, but in the story Shaq thought he was living. Because the cafe wasn't just a fresh start. It was a cover. Digging into the property records felt like lifting a floorboard on the entire town. The land beneath Griggs Sons had changed hands 4 times in 70 years. Each transfer was shrouded in oddities, sales with no buyer signatures, missing documents, ownership affidavits signed by people who hadn't been alive long enough to witness the first transaction. The original title was registered in 1939 to a James Griggs, a local black businessman, who operated a small bakery known for its cornbread and honey-glazed pecan pie. The business was called Griggs Sons. The same name Shaq had revived without knowing why it had come to him so instinctively. The bakery burned down in 1963. No police report. No insurance payout. No investigation. Just a charred patch of dirt. And then silence. 2 years later, the land was purchased for a symbolic $10 by a holding company, operated by one Lawrence Cale, Brandon's grandfather. Shaq sat with that fact like a stone in his gut. It wasn't just about Walter anymore. It was about a legacy of erasure. He brought the papers to Lydia first. She had been managing the cafe's books and community events, but Shaq saw in her a mind sharp enough to cut through red tape and a heart stubborn enough not to flinch. She read the documents twice, her fingers tightening on the printouts. This wasn't a purchase, she said finally. This was a theft. A sanitized, notarized theft. Together they began tracing the Kale family's real estate acquisitions. Shaq had his legal team pull property portfolios, political donations, tax records. What emerged was a lattice of land deals that all followed the same pattern. Black-owned businesses burned, folded or sold, followed by quiet takeovers under shell corporations. Many were then redeveloped into lucrative commercial properties, each with a ribbon cutting and a smiling photo op, but not a single acknowledgement of who had once stood there. The cafe was just one node in a network of buried stories, and the town had made peace with forgetting. Shaq walked the sidewalks differently now. Past the boutique candy shop that used to be a church. Past the art gallery that had once been a boarding house for migrant workers. Every time he passed one of Brandon's holdings, he felt the history pulsing beneath it, like a vein ready to burst. But the town didn't want to talk about any of it. When Shaq brought the findings to a local journalist, a young white reporter named Cal, who claimed to care about truth-telling, he was met with politeness and then silence. The article never ran. The newspaper issued a bland statement about ongoing review and editorial discretion. Within a week, Cal had been reassigned to sports. Then the whispers began. Councilman Jack Reed, a polished politician with 3 generations of influence behind him, started appearing more often at civic events near the cafe. Always cordial, always watching. One afternoon he approached Shaq outside Griggs Sons, handed him a bottle of locally brewed cider, and said, "I respect what you're doing. Just be careful about opening old wounds. Some things are better left where they lay." Shaq accepted the cider, then threw it in the trash. Because wounds don't disappear when ignored. They rot. The walls inside the cafe began to whisper louder. Shaq brought in local historian Gloria Finch, a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years collecting oral histories from black elders too often dismissed as unreliable. Gloria came armed with tape recorders, file boxes, and a steel spine. She set up interviews in the back room, offering sweet tea and biscuits to anyone willing to speak. And they came slowly at first, then in a quiet wave. What they said wasn't pretty. Stories of firebombed homes, threats scrawled on church doors, a sheriff who lost reports, men who vanished, women who stopped reporting because nothing changed, all while the town smiled for its 4th of July parades and patted itself on the back for never having riots. Gloria cross-referenced their stories with public records. When things didn't match, she dug deeper. The truth wasn't just painful, it was strategic. The omissions weren't accidents. They were engineered. One night, long after the cafe had closed, Shaq sat alone with Gloria and Lydia. The 3 of them circled around a table, covered in photographs, maps, and handwritten testimonies. Shaq picked up one black and white photo, 4 boys standing outside a wooden storefront. One of them had a lopsided smile and a flour-stained apron. "Lewis Griggs," Gloria said softly. "That's Walter's father, the one who built the bakery before it burned." Shaq stared at the photo. "He had sons?" "One," Gloria nodded. "Walter." The name sat heavy. They had come full circle. Walter's disappearance made more sense now. Not a retreat, a release. He had carried this history in silence for so long, and now that someone else had picked it up, he could finally lay it down. The next morning, Shaq began building something new inside the cafe. Not another coffee station, not a juice bar, a wall. But not just any wall. The legacy wall. Photos, testimonies, deeds, letters. A living timeline that traced the town's stolen history, not as an accusation but as an invitation to witness. Customers could read, touch, learn. Names returned to the space like light breaking through a boarded-up window. Reactions varied. Some cried. Some left angry. One elderly white couple asked if there was a normal section they could sit in. Shaq didn't flinch. He simply pointed to the nearest chair. Because history isn't meant to be digested with comfort. It's meant to be confronted with conscience. The town tried to pretend nothing had changed. But change doesn't need permission. It only needs truth. And truth was now pinned to a wall in the place they used to call Maple and Grain. Some customers stopped coming, but many who had never stepped foot in the cafe before now showed up daily. A young black mother brought her son and sat him in front of the legacy wall, reading every name aloud. A local teacher brought her class. A man from 2 towns over drove 40 minutes just to sit in Walter's old seat and sip a cup of coffee like it meant something. And it did. Because now the air carried memory, and the walls no longer whispered. They testified. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of day where nothing special was supposed to happen. The café was quiet. A few laptops glowed in corners. A couple of regulars sipped slowly, watching the light bend across the wood-grain tables. Shaq was behind the counter, organizing supplies with the kind of absent-minded rhythm that comes after too many early mornings, and just enough progress to make the fight feel worth it. That's when his fingers brushed the edge of something lodged deep behind the old register drawer. Something wedged between the wall and the worn baseboard. It didn't feel like money or paper trash. It was thicker, stiff. He pried it free slowly, careful not to rip the yellowing edge, and held it up to the light. It was a photograph. Black and white, small, maybe 5 by 7. The kind of photo you'd tuck into a wallet or tape behind a mirror. On the front it showed a young black boy, no more than 10, standing barefoot in front of a storefront. The sign above him read Griggs Bakery, barely visible in the photo's faded contrast. The boy stood straight, one hand resting against the doorframe, the other holding a paper bag, like he'd just made a delivery. His clothes were clean but simple. His expression carried the kind of stubborn pride that comes before the world teaches you how dangerous pride can be. Shaq turned it over. On the back, written in child's handwriting, were the words, "To Mama, from Lewis." Shaq stared at the inscription. Time seemed to stretch around him, muffling the sounds of the café. His hands went still. He looked again at the face in the photo. Eyes clear, smile small but sure. There was something familiar about the boy, something that didn't fade with the photo's age. He showed it to Lydia first. She took it carefully, as if the paper itself might crack. Her brow furrowed as she studied it. "Lewis Griggs?" she whispered. "That can't be a coincidence." Shaq nodded. "Has to be Walter's father. The name matches, and the date lines up with when the bakery was still open." They stared at the image like it might speak if they listened long enough. Lydia said, "You think Walter left it behind on purpose?" "Maybe," Shaq murmured. "Or maybe the building held on to it. Some stories don't want to stay buried." They decided not to frame the photo just yet. Shaq wanted to know more before turning it into another artifact on the legacy wall. He started showing it to people. Carefully, selectively, mostly older residents, people who had lived through the 60s or whose parents had whispered the truth after locking the doors. The reactions were never casual. One elderly man who ran the antique shop across the street stared at the photo and went quiet for a full minute before saying, "Never knew the boy's name." Then he walked away without another word. A former schoolteacher blinked at the photo, pressed her lips together, and said, "There were a lot of fires back then, not just buildings." Then she asked Shaq not to use her name. Another man, pale and trembling, claimed he'd never seen the photo before, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Shaq could feel the tension rising, thick and metallic in the air. Every reaction was a thread in a much larger net, and that net was drawing in tighter. It was Miss Corinne who gave the story shape. She was the town's retired librarian, a woman whose hands had touched every book spine in the county, and whose memory was as sharp as glass in winter. She lived in a modest house not far from the café, surrounded by cats and boxes of forgotten local history. Shaq visited her late one afternoon, photo in hand. When he laid it on her kitchen table, she didn't ask why he'd come. She just stared at the image. Her eyes welled slowly. Her breath caught in her throat. "That boy never came home," she said softly. Shaq leaned in. "You remember him?" She nodded. Everyone did. Lewis was bright, always helping at the bakery. Sweet boy, loved math. Used to ask me for old crossword puzzles from the Sunday paper. Shaq didn't interrupt. He disappeared in the fall of '63, Corinne continued, right after the bakery burned. Folks said he ran off. Others whispered different things. But the truth is no one looked. Not really. And the people who might have known what happened, they never talked. Her voice dropped. His father, Joseph, tried to file a report, walked right into the station. They laughed at him, said there was no point, told him Lewis probably got mixed up with the wrong crowd. That's what they used to say when they didn't want to admit something worse. Shaq felt the weight of it settle on his chest. Corinne gently pushed the photo back toward him. That picture? That's a boy trying to matter. Trying to say, see me, remember me, and the world didn't listen. Shaq left her house changed. He carried the photo in his coat pocket, like a living thing. At night, he stared at it longer than he meant to. In the morning, he found himself walking slower past the legacy wall, wondering if it needed a new center. He had lawyers look for records. Nothing. No school files after 1963. No census entry. No obituary. No grave. Lewis Griggs had vanished like he was never there. And yet here he was, in black and white, smiling for a mother who may have waited at the door every evening for a son who never made it home. Shaq met with Gloria Finch the next day, laid the photo on her desk like a case file. We have to find out what happened, he said. This isn't just about Walter anymore. It's about justice left hanging in the wind. Gloria's eyes narrowed. Then we start with the old county school board. They kept better records than the city ever did. It was a slow process, but they found fragments. A school enrollment card, a medical record from a local clinic, a single photo in a third-grade yearbook, and then it stopped. The paper trail ended like a breath cut short. Back at the cafe, Shaq made a decision. He placed the photograph in the center of the legacy wall. No frame, just a clear pocket, and a small placard underneath. Lewis Griggs, a boy who disappeared. A story that hasn't. Customers stared. Some asked. Some didn't. A few left quickly. But many lingered. And late that night, after the cafe had closed, someone slipped a letter under the front door. No name, no return address. It read, I remember Lewis. I saw what happened. But I was only a kid. I didn't know what to do. If you're reading this, it means you're still looking. And if you're still looking, I think you're ready to know the rest. The note was unsigned, but it was enough. Shaq read it twice. Then he locked the cafe, slipped the photo back into his coat, and looked out at the town, the storefronts, the lamp-lit sidewalks, the buildings built on silence. The truth was still out there, and he was going to find it. The morning the new sign went up, the sky was clean and sharp as steel. Griggs & Sons hung from fresh bronze brackets, the letters cut deep into thick unfinished wood, deliberately old-fashioned, like something reclaimed from a time before things got buried. Customers arriving early for their caffeine fix stared up at it, unsure what to make of the name. Some said nothing. Others frowned. A few smirked knowingly, then turned around and walked away. Shaq had expected that. Rebranding wasn't just about marketing. Not here. It was a statement, a refusal to play by the soft shoe rules the town had used for decades to dodge its own reflection. This cafe wasn't going to offer peace for the price of forgetfulness. It was going to serve something stronger and harder to swallow. He didn't stop at the name. Inside, the walls that once held chalkboard menus and soft art prints now bore something different entirely. The legacy wall had grown into a full exhibit. Newspaper clippings, blown-up photographs, copies of land deeds, written statements from those willing to speak on the record. There were maps showing the migration of black families out of town, lines drawn in red, then erased in white. There were quotes from Lewis Griggs's school reports, scribbled with teacher comments like bright but should remember his place. Every story, every image, every piece was curated not for comfort, but for clarity. At the heart of the display was the boy in the photograph. Lewis, smiling with a paper bag in one hand and history in the other. Shaq placed a new placard beneath the photo. They erased him. So we remember him louder. Customers came in, paused, looked up and changed. Some stood frozen. Some grew visibly uncomfortable. A few scoffed and called it political nonsense. One man muttered something about not being able to enjoy coffee without guilt. Another pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, his hands trembling slightly. Not everyone stayed. Some stormed out. A few tore their loyalty punch cards in half and left them on the floor. One older woman came every day and sat silently beneath the photo of Lewis for hours, sipping only water. But others came because of it. Teachers brought classes, artists asked to contribute work, local activists offered to host evening discussions in the cafe's side room. People came from nearby towns after hearing rumors about the cafe with the museum inside. The truth was drawing a crowd, but it wasn't drawing peace. Shaq began receiving anonymous notes, folded slips under the door, mailed without return addresses, slipped between windshield wipers. Some were simple, stay in your lane, you're not from here. Others were uglier, threats masked as jokes, sarcasm, soaked in venom. One arrived wrapped around a burned matchstick. He didn't tell Lydia about them at first, but when the third note arrived, this one stapled to a printout of the cafe's inspection history, he slid it across the counter toward her. She read it slowly, then looked up at him. "They're building something," she said. "A case. Or a reason." Shaq nodded. Brandon hadn't been back in weeks, but his absence had become a presence. He wasn't showing up in person anymore. He was working behind the curtain, whispering in ears, feeding bitterness in back rooms. Rumor had it he was offering incentives to local shops that agreed to cancel orders from Griggs Sons. A few vendors had already backed out. One claimed equipment issues. Another just stopped answering. Then the health inspector arrived. He wore the kind of smile that came with practiced neutrality, clipboard in hand, badge flashing just enough to remind everyone of authority. He ordered everyone out of the kitchen and began checking temperatures, water lines, storage units. He pointed to the old tiles beneath the sink. "These weren't installed to code. I'm surprised this passed last year." Shaq leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "It passed because the old owner played golf with your director." The inspector didn't respond, just made another note on his clipboard. 20 minutes later, he handed Shaq a bright yellow document and said, "Pending review. Temporary closure due to safety code violations. Could be a week. Could be longer." Shaq took the paper without blinking. He didn't yell, didn't argue. He knew the script. You tell the truth loud enough, and they start inspecting your walls instead of their own reflection. By the time the inspector left, word had already begun to spread. Customers showed up mid-afternoon to locked doors and taped signs. One man knocked twice, then stood on the sidewalk shaking his head, muttering, "Of course, they couldn't let it live." Shaq stood behind the counter that night, staring at the empty space like it was a puzzle, with a missing corner. Lydia sat beside him, sorting vendor invoices, a frown etched deep into her forehead. "You think Brandon pulled the trigger?" she asked. "I think the system pulled it for him," Shaq replied. "He just reminded it where to aim." Lydia tapped the table. "What now? We wait? Fix what they say's broken?" "We do that," Shaq said. "And something more." The next day, Shaq didn't open the cafe. Instead, he opened the sidewalk. He wheeled out folding tables, laid down extension cords, set up 2 percolators, and a donation box labeled community coffee. Pay what you can. He placed laminated copies of the cafe's health inspection history on each table, side by side with the note they'd received, and a timeline of every visit Brandon Cale's family made to the zoning board in the last year. People came, some curious, others angry. A few read everything and walked away speechless. Shaq didn't preach, he just poured coffee and let the story tell itself. By the third day, a local news crew showed up. Not the sanitized city paper, the independent crew from 2 towns over. The one that had aired a segment last year about land seizures during the post-war migration. They interviewed customers, took slow pans of the mural, captured the boy in the photograph. Shaq stood in front of the cafe as they rolled tape and said, "They shut our doors, but they couldn't shut the story. So we serve it here now. Hot, black, and unfiltered." It went viral. Not overnight, but steadily. The clip spread. Shared, reposted, quoted. Suddenly, national outlets began calling. Activists reached out. Teachers from neighboring counties asked for tours. Donations rolled in from people who'd never set foot in the cafe, but recognized the shape of injustice when they saw it dressed in paperwork. But not everyone clapped. The town council called an emergency session. Councilman Jack Reed made a statement about protecting local business standards and ensuring fair inspections. A second inspection was scheduled. This one by a different agency. Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He'd already won something else.
Visibility.
The next week, Griggs & Sons reopened. But the line wasn't just for coffee anymore. It was for what the cafe now stood for. And every person who walked in had to walk past the legacy wall. Past Lewis, past history, and into something no code could shut down. Because Shaq wasn't selling drinks anymore. He was selling truth. And the thing about truth, it sells harder than coffee. The fire wasn't big. It didn't climb rooftops or light up the night sky. It wasn't dramatic enough to draw sirens. It was the kind of fire that finishes its work quietly, just enough flame to turn records to ash and memories to dust. It started in the basement of the zoning office, in the old records room, beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference. When Shaq arrived the next morning, the door was sealed with caution tape, and the secretary had the kind of practiced sympathy reserved for small disasters with convenient explanation. Faulty wiring, she said. Probably a surge. But Shaq wasn't interested in the how. He was focused on the when specifically. Just days after the cafe's reopening, and exactly 48 hours after Gloria Finch had submitted a formal request to access deeds from the 1950s, the same documents they needed to tie Brandon Cale's family to the illegal acquisition of the Griggs Bakery property. Shaq didn't flinch in front of the secretary. He just nodded once, turned around, and walked out into the sun with the kind of silence that meant calculation. This wasn't the first time history had been rewritten with matches, and it wouldn't be the last. But they weren't relying on those files. They had backups. Gloria had insisted on scanning every document they touched. Digital copies stored on multiple encrypted drives. One at the cafe, one at her house, another with Lydia, and a fourth on a private server Shaq had his tech team set up. Paranoia wasn't paranoia when the ghosts of the past were still breathing. But whoever set that fire had done it for a reason. Someone was afraid of what might be found. That fear grew louder 2 days later, when Miss Corinne's house was broken into. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no valuables missing. But her filing cabinets, meticulously labeled, alphabetized and locked, had been emptied. Pages torn from folders, photo negatives shredded, her desk drawers pulled out and dumped onto the floor like someone had run out of time or patience. Corinne called Shaq before she called the police. When he arrived, she was sitting on her porch in a heavy cardigan, holding a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes were dry, her voice steel. "They didn't take anything," she said. "They just wanted to make sure I couldn't prove anything." Shaq walked through the house. The destruction was focused, almost surgical. No vandalism, no random chaos. Just a brutal efficiency designed to erase decades of documentation. But whoever had done it hadn't known what Corinne knew, that she'd already scanned and uploaded every file related to the Griggs family and Brandon Cale's lineage weeks ago, after Shaq had first uncovered the buried bakery records. They had tried to kill the evidence, but the evidence had already grown roots. Shaq left her house with a different kind of fire burning. Not the hot kind, the kind that smolders low and doesn't go out. He spent that night walking through the town, his hood up, slipping between storefronts and alleyways, like a man listening to a place breathe. The town had changed, yes, but some things still stank of old power, masked in polite conversation and sealed deals. The name that kept surfacing wasn't Brandon anymore. It was Councilman Jack Reed. Jack had been a background character until now. Smooth-talking, media-savvy, always ready with a quote about unity and moving forward. But his fingerprints were beginning to show up in strange places. Zoning memos, vendor contracts, business permits quietly delayed, donations from Cale family accounts showing up under political committees, with bland names like Preserve Heritage and Common Roots Coalition. Reed wasn't just part of the old system. He was the system. He had inherited it like a suit tailored generations ago, buttoned up, spotless on the outside, but stitched with things no one wanted to name. His grandfather had served on the same council. His father had run the local bank. His cousin sat on the board of education. And somewhere along that bloodline, a deal had been made that buried the Griggs family's past. Shaq didn't confront Reed right away. He knew better. You don't tip your hand before the river card drops. Instead, he doubled down. The day after Corinne's break-in, he held a silent exhibition outside the cafe. Rows of laminated records, recovered testimonies, blown-up images of fire-damaged property deeds, all laid out in plastic sleeves under plexiglass on the sidewalk. No signs, no speeches, just the truth, presented like evidence. The townspeople didn't know what to do with it. Some stared, some turned their eyes away. A few tourists took photos, unaware of what they were standing in front of. But the ones who had lived through the silence, they lingered, whispered, pointed to names they remembered, and pretended they didn't. Later that week, a former city clerk dropped off a manila envelope at the cafe, unsigned. Inside were 3 scans of old meeting minutes from 1963. One of them referenced the redistribution of certain properties following structural damage and absentee ownership. One address stood out, 115 West Granger, the site of the original Griggs Bakery. It was official. The council had declared the property abandoned within 48 hours of the fire.
No investigation. No notification to the family.
Just an emergency vote held by 5 white men in one empty chair meant for a councilman who could not be reached. Shaq read the minutes over and over. This wasn't just negligence, it was calculated erasure. The final nail came from Lydia, who had been quietly tracing political donations from the Kale Family Trust. She found one particularly large contribution made last year to Jack Reed's re-election campaign, hidden under the name of a charitable foundation that had no office, no phone number, and a website that hadn't been updated in 7 years. When she showed Shaq the paperwork, he sat back in the cafe's small office, the same place he'd first read the health code violations, and exhaled through his nose like a man trying not to break a wall with his fist. "Now we know who's scared," he said. Lydia nodded. "And why?" That night, the cafe windows were tagged. No swastikas, no slurs, just one word, sprayed in red paint across the front glass like a warning. Enough. They left it up for 2 days. People stopped to stare. Some interpreted it as support, others as a threat. But Shaq knew exactly what it was. Panic. Someone was losing control of the story. And stories, once they start spilling, don't go back in the bottle. By the week's end, Shaq made his first public move. He released a full digital archive of the Griggs Sons' historical findings on a website hosted independently, with servers in multiple cities. The site included scanned deeds, testimonies, photographs, and a running timeline that documented not just what had been taken from the Griggs family, but how it had been covered up by the very people now calling for calm and closure. Within 48 hours, the site had over 100,000 visitors. Within 72, it had been flagged for historical defamation by a newly formed legal committee, chaired by a name no one was surprised to see, Jack Reed. But the damage was already done. Truth had gone digital, and it couldn't be burned. That weekend, a group of high school students showed up at the cafe wearing shirts they'd printed themselves. On the back, in bold white letters, it read, "Who burned the files?" Shaq stood behind the counter, watching them line up for drinks, for stories, for something real. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The truth was walking now, and it wasn't afraid of smoke. The street was still asleep when Shaq arrived. The air hung heavy, a little too quiet, as if something had been taken while the world looked the other way. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not coffee, not flour or sugar, but the raw chemical sting of spray paint. He turned the corner and froze. The front of Griggs & Sons had been hit. Not with art, with hate. The windows were tagged in thick black lines. Slurs sprawled across the glass like venom. Crude symbols drawn without thought, but full of intent. Across the front door, in red paint that dripped like blood, were the words, "Shut it down." The power had been cut, too. The lights inside the cafe were dark. The flicker of the security alarm had gone silent. They hadn't just vandalized the building, they'd tried to erase it. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with. Shaq didn't call the police. Not yet. He stood in front of the building, scanning the mess like an archaeologist reading a broken tablet. Behind the anger, behind the fear disguised as graffiti, there was a message: "You've gone too far." But that's what systems always say when you pull back the curtain. When you refuse to play polite. By sunrise, word had spread. The first to arrive was Lydia. Eyes wide, jaw tight, fists clenched. Then came Gloria Finch, lips pressed together like she was biting back a curse. Students showed up next. Kids in their teens and early 20s, faces taut with disbelief. One of them pulled out his phone to start recording, but Shaq gently lowered it. "Not this time," he said. "We're not feeding their story. We're telling ours." Then he went to work. In the hours that followed, while the cafe remained dark, Shaq had generators delivered. Massive, industrial-grade floodlights were wheeled in and bolted into place on tripods. Extension cords ran like veins across the sidewalk. He didn't clean the windows. He didn't scrub off the paint. He lit it up instead. By the time the sun went down, the entire front of Griggs & Sons was glowing in white-hot light. Every slur, every smear, every angry stroke on full display. Nothing hidden. No edits. No filters. And just beneath the floodlights, Shaq set up a podium. No microphones. No press. Just him. And truth. They began to gather around dusk. Locals. Travelers. Activists. Reporters who'd been ignoring the story 3 weeks ago, now jostled for space near the back. The sidewalk filled. The street filled. Someone pulled up folding chairs. Others stood on curbs. No one asked what was happening. They already knew. Shaq stepped up to the podium, a thick folder in his hands. It was old, frayed at the corners, but perfectly preserved. Inside were the original deeds to 115 West Granger, the plot where Griggs Bakery had once stood, now home to a café built on silence. He didn't clear his throat. Didn't open with pleasantries. He opened with dates. March 14, 1951. The county approved a property deed transfer to Joseph Griggs, owner, operator, taxpayer. The crowd was hushed. June 20, 1963. Griggs Bakery burns. Fire investigation. Never filed. No official cause. No arrests. July 10, 1963. The town council declares the property abandoned and authorizes transfer to the Kale Holding Company for $1. He paused. Let it sink in. Institutional theft wrapped in law, buried in bureaucracy. He held up the pages, one by one for the cameras and crowd to see. These are not stories. These are facts. Then he turned to the next page. Enrollment records from 1962. Lewis Griggs, 10 years old, student, son, employee of the bakery, disappeared after the fire. No police report, no obituary, no trace. He placed the photograph of the boy on the podium. This was his life, Shaq said, and this was what they tried to burn. The crowd was silent, not out of boredom, but reverence. Then something shifted in the back, a quiet ripple of motion. A slow, deliberate path cut through the spectators until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Walter Griggs, older now, more frail, but unmistakable. He hadn't been seen in weeks. Some thought he'd left for good. Some thought he didn't want to be found. But there he stood, pressed slacks, a modest hat, his army jacket zipped up against the breeze. Shaq saw him. Their eyes locked. No words passed between them. But something did. Walter stepped forward. Shaq moved aside, offered the podium with a simple gesture. Walter didn't speak right away. He looked at the papers, the photo, the building. Then he turned to the crowd and said, calm, quiet, but sharp as a scalpel, "My father didn't run. He was run out." His voice didn't waver. My brother didn't vanish. He was erased. A collective exhale swept the crowd. Walter went on. They told my mother he'd gone off with bad kids, that he'd gotten into trouble. But she knew better. She searched every alley, every road, and when she cried at night, she never cried for what she lost. She cried because no one else ever looked. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the photo back on the podium. I was 9 when I last saw Lewis. He told me to stay home that day. Said he'd be back by dinner. He never came. I waited on the porch until the sun went down. Then again the next day, and the day after that, and eventually, I stopped. The crowd was still. Not even the wind interrupted. Walter looked up, his eyes sharper than anyone had seen them before. I came back because someone finally did what this town never had the courage to. He looked, he told the truth, and he didn't flinch. He turned toward Shaq. I thank you. The words landed heavier than any speech. When Walter stepped down, Shaq returned to the podium. He reached for the final page. A notarized witness statement, recently recovered, signed by a former city maintenance worker. It placed a young Lewis Griggs near a city vehicle the day after the fire, crying, holding a bag of bread, and then, nothing. Shaq didn't need to explain what that meant. The crowd understood. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Later, when the lights dimmed and the last of the crowd dispersed, the paint still remained on the cafe's walls. Shaq didn't touch it. He left it as proof, not of what was done to them, but of what they survived. The cafe reopened the next day. Not a single chair was empty. Orders flew out faster than the staff could pour. Donations arrived from cities across the country. But more importantly, stories arrived. People mailed their own photos, their own documents, their own erased history. Because once truth sees daylight, it multiplies. And even when the lights go out, it remembers the way back. The truth didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments. Scattered pieces of a buried puzzle that had waited 60 years for someone to care enough to put it together. It came through whispers, overlooked notes, forgotten testimonies, and one final envelope mailed from a nursing home 3 counties away. No return address, just a typewritten confession, brittle with age but sharp with detail. Shaq read it in the stillness of his office. No music, no light, but the soft hum of the desk lamp. The words were plain, undramatic, which somehow made them worse. I saw the boy. They didn't mean to kill him. At first, The letter went on to describe a scene as cruel as it was familiar. A group of local men, one of them wearing a maintenance uniform, had caught Lewis behind a hardware store the night after the fire. He was scared, alone, carrying a small bag of bread. They accused him of looting. They said he matched a description. They wanted to teach him a lesson. He begged to go home. They beat him, called it discipline. When he went limp, they panicked. Someone, a man in a green truck, said it was too late, so they made it permanent. There were no names in the letter, but the details matched everything Shaq and Gloria had uncovered. The location, the timeline, the vehicles. The letter concluded with a single line. They buried him behind the old East Orchard. No marker, no prayer. Shaq didn't move for a long time after reading it. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just injustice. It was a cover-up orchestrated across generations, woven into the very fabric of the town's image of itself. Lewis Griggs hadn't disappeared. He'd been lynched. Quietly, efficiently, and those responsible had lived full lives, raised families, held office, hosted fundraisers. One of them had a last name that still sat on the city council. Reed. Gloria confirmed it 2 days later. She pulled the personnel records from the town archive, copies that had miraculously survived the accidental fire. Jack Reed's grandfather, Harold Reed, had been head of code enforcement. He'd also served as liaison between the council and police. He signed the original motion to deem the Griggs property abandoned. And Brandon Cale's grandfather? He funded the emergency restoration project that turned the ashes of the bakery into a new lot, one that would eventually house Maple and Grain. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. Shaq didn't tell the press. Not yet. He called Walter. They met at dawn, beneath a live oak tree behind the orchard. The grass was brittle, the soil sun-hardened. Walter carried nothing but a walking stick and a folder of Lewis's school papers, yellowed but intact. He didn't ask questions. He knew what this was. They found the grave using an old aerial photograph, one that showed a subtle depression in the earth where no trees had grown since the 60s. No gravestone, no plaque, just silence. Shaq brought in a ground-penetrating radar team that same afternoon. No fanfare, no cameras. The results were clear. There, beneath 4 feet of soil, were human remains, small bones. A child's. It was Lewis. Walter knelt at the edge, silent. His hands rested on his knees like a prayer. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just exhaled. He's home now, he said. They didn't wait for the council to approve a burial permit. Shaq used private land owned by a nearby church, one that had welcomed Lewis's mother all those years ago, after the bakery burned. They held the ceremony under a slate sky, gray and respectful. No umbrellas, no choir, just names. Shaq read the eulogy. Lewis Griggs. Son, brother, dreamer, silenced not by time, but by cowardice, forgotten not by fate, but by force, remembered now forever. The gravestone was simple. Lewis Griggs. 19. They tried to erase him. We wrote him back. The press descended fast. National headlines. Live segments. Think pieces. The café was swarmed by reporters. Some genuine, others just chasing clicks. Interviews were requested. Documentaries pitched. But Shaq turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in making grief go viral. Still, the facts couldn't be contained. News outlets published the timeline: birth, bakery, fire, murder, burial. They showed maps, interview clips, even side-by-side photos of Harold Reed and his grandson Jack. People began calling for Reed's resignation. Protesters showed up to City Hall. Shaq watched it unfold like a storm he didn't start, but could no longer avoid. Reed made his move first. He held a press conference beneath the county courthouse steps, flanked by lawyers and aides. He denied knowledge of his grandfather's actions, called the accusations historical distortion, claimed Shaq was inflaming divisions for personal gain. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't have to. The documents did. More came forward. A retired cop admitted he was told to ignore the bakery fire. A nurse recalled treating a bruised boy in 63 who disappeared from the clinic without discharge. Stories flooded in, not just about Lewis but about others. Names that had gone missing in the files, now spoken aloud for the first time in decades. Meanwhile, Brandon Cale disappeared from public life. His real estate firm went quiet. Anonymous posts hinted he'd left the state, visiting family indefinitely. Shaq suspected he'd return someday, after the headlines faded, but he wouldn't return to the same town. Because the town had changed, Walter began visiting the cafe again. Not daily, not always during business hours, but enough. He'd sit in the corner near the legacy wall, sip his coffee, and sometimes leave handwritten notes under Lewis's photo. No one read them. They weren't for anyone else. Lydia, now managing the cafe full-time, added a new section to the legacy wall, a digital display that let visitors scroll through archival evidence, photos, and testimony. Children would gather around it, tapping through screens that told them the stories their schools never had. Gloria launched a town-wide history project, gathering accounts from other families who'd been forced out or forgotten. The project spread first through town halls, then churches, then schools. Some called it uncomfortable. Others called it healing. Shaq never sought credit. He walked the town like a man who'd finished something he wasn't sure he was meant to start. But the impact was visible. The council eventually forced Reed to step down. His resignation letter was dry, bureaucratic, but the headline that ran the next morning said it better. Truth outlives power. That summer, tourists began arriving, not for the coffee, but for what the cafe had become, a living archive. A space of reckoning. Schools from out of state, scheduled field trips. Activists used it as a blueprint for similar projects. People who had once ignored Walter now stopped to shake his hand. But Shaq knew not everyone would change. Some still looked away when they walked past the photo of Lewis. Some still muttered when they saw the headstone. But others stayed longer, read more, listened, and that was enough. Because history doesn't need everyone to accept it. It only needs enough to remember. The slurs on the windows had long been scrubbed clean, but not forgotten. They were replaced with sunlit handprints from school children, who now came every week. Paint-streaked palms, different shades of brown, beige, honey, pink. Names printed underneath in permanent marker, not for display but for ownership, for presence, for proof. Outside, the new sign over the cafe entrance had changed again. It was more than a name. It was a declaration. Inside, the espresso machine still hissed and steamed. People still ordered their macchiatos and pastries. But beyond the counter, past the hum of small talk and the tapping of laptop keys, were new spaces that hadn't existed when Shaq first bought the place. A glass-walled reading room stocked with scanned county records, oral histories, and digitized property maps. A classroom converted from what used to be the staff break room. A side wing under construction with a banner hanging above it. Coming soon, Lewis Griggs Youth Center for Civic Literacy. The cafe was no longer a cafe in the way people expected. It was a reckoning wrapped in warm cinnamon scent. It was a living museum disguised as a coffee shop. It was a challenge dressed as a community hub, and it was working. Not perfectly, not easily, but undeniably. The pushback had faded, not disappeared, but dimmed beneath the weight of exposure. Reed's resignation came with the usual soft language, shifting priorities, time with family, but everyone knew the truth. And more importantly, now they acknowledged it. Brandon Cale's disappearance remained complete. No public statements, no lawsuits filed. His family's development projects had been quietly cancelled, reabsorbed by banks with no interest in drama. Word had it he'd been living abroad, self-reflecting. One article claimed. Shaq didn't follow. He didn't need to. The goal had never been revenge. It had been remembrance. And no one remembered more than Walter Griggs. After the dedication at Lewis's gravesite, Walter had become the reluctant elder of a movement he never meant to lead. People asked him for advice, stories, signatures, but he kept to the edges, preferring silence and slow walks through the cafe. Sometimes he'd stop at the legacy wall and place his palm gently against the photo of Lewis, as if steadying it. He rarely spoke during those moments. Only once did Shaq catch him whisper something. Still watching, little brother. He began showing up less as the days passed. His hands grew slower, his gait more careful, but he never missed the Sunday morning hour. Shaq had carved it out just for him. From 8 to 9 a.m., the cafe dimmed the lights, played soft gospel music, served no orders, and opened only to veterans, widows and elders who just wanted to sit and remember. It became sacred. It was at the end of one such morning, as Shaq wiped down the counter in the quiet, that Walter approached him. His jacket looked heavier that day, his voice thinner. "I got something," he said. From his coat, he pulled a photograph. It was cracked at the corners. The black and white tones faded into sepia. but the image still burned clear. Lewis again. This time not outside the bakery, but inside it, covered in flour, arms crossed, wearing a crooked apron 2 sizes too big. And he was laughing. Fully. Eyes shut, teeth showing, joy unfiltered. Walter placed the photo in Shaq's hand. "This one's for you," he said. It's time he lived somewhere people would see him every day. That was the last time they spoke. 2 weeks later, Walter passed quietly in his sleep. No pain, no struggle, just the café closed for a day in his honor. The staff wore black aprons. Gloria held a candlelight vigil. Lydia placed the photo in a frame carved by a local woodworker and mounted it under a new header on the legacy wall. Shaq gave the eulogy. His voice didn't break, but it did lower when he said Walter's name. He waited his whole life for someone to remember his brother, and when that happened, he gave us something greater. A blueprint, a way to stand still and move forward at the same time. The town didn't fully understand how much it had changed until the dedication ceremony the following spring. By then the youth center was finished. Bright walls, book-lined shelves, student art, a full schedule of civic classes, voter education, free tutoring. The morning of the ribbon cutting, families lined the sidewalks, teachers, elders, kids who only knew Lewis Griggs as a photograph, but knew that photo better than their own history books. Shaq stood at the podium in front of the new wing. His hands were steady, his voice clear. He didn't read from notes. "We gather here not just to open a new space, but to reopen an old wound. Not because we like pain, but because we know healing never happens in the dark." He paused. Lewis Griggs should have lived. He should have grown old, made mistakes, laughed more. He should have been allowed to stand where I stand now. He held up the photograph Walter had given him, now framed behind protective glass. "We don't heal by pretending it never happened. We heal by remembering who paid the price." The applause didn't thunder. It rippled. Soft. Reverent. Like a town learning how to feel something. For the first time in decades. After the ceremony, people stayed. They toured the new space. Some stood in front of the legacy wall and cried without trying to stop it. Others sat in the café, sipping slowly, watching history dance across digital screens. Shaq walked the floor like he always did, quietly, nodding, listening. Later that evening, after the last visitor left, Lydia found him sitting in the corner seat where Walter used to sit. She brought him coffee. "You all right?" she asked. Shaq nodded. "Yeah." Then he looked around. "I think we're finally doing it." She tilted her head. "Doing what?" "Serving more than coffee." And they were. They were serving memory. Serving justice. Serving a future where a 10-year-old boy in a too big apron would never again be invisible. They didn't need statues. They had a name, and that name would never be forgotten again. If this story stirred something in you, it's because it was never just fiction. Names like Lewis Griggs live in every town, every silence, every system. Ask what's been buried, where you live. Then decide who you'll be when the truth finally knocks. Because justice doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts in coffee shops.